Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of r/ProRevenge. In today's episode, Justice finally. You said any character. The referee's compliance. Before we get started, make sure to subscribe so you will never miss a video. So let's get started. Justice finally. Hi there. First things first. I don't know if this is the correct subreddit for the story, so feel free to point out one that fits better. I just want to tell the story to someone. English isn't my first language, so I ran the story through Google Translate. If you find any bad phrasings, typos or spelling errors, feel free to correct me in the comments, or just ignore them. The whole story was a few years ago and is very convoluted. In order not to write a novel here, I try to keep things clear and as short as possible. If some things are incomprehensible, I am happy to submit updates upon request. Yes, we were too trustworthy, and in retrospect we should have done more earlier. The story begins in the early 90s when my parents got divorced. My mother had been given custody of me and my older sister by the court. We moved into my maternal grandmother's house. The house was built by my grandfather in the 50s and had never been renovated. There were 2 apartments in the house. One apartment on the ground floor and one on the first floor. My grandma lived in the lower apartment. But even though it was actually too small for a woman with 2 teenage children in the upper apartment, my mother initially wanted us to see the house as 2 separate households. It took my grandma some time to convince my mother to consider the house as a whole as not my grandmother's, but ours. My mother and grandma decided not only to renovate the house, but also to refurbish it. But before that could happen, something important had to be clarified. Because my grandfather had built the house, and he died without writing his last will, the house was not legally owned by my grandmother at the time, but belonged in part to my mother and her sister, let's call her Estelle. My grandma bought Estelle's share. The 40-year-old stove heating was replaced by a floor heating that was modern at the time, windows were renewed, old pipes and cables were replaced, and much more. My mother put all of the money my father gave her after the divorce into the house. Among other things, she paid off an old loan that was still on the house. In order not to repeat my grandfather's mistake, the 3 made a will. The share in the house that belongs to my grandmother should go to my mother after her death, as she lived in the house and contributed significantly to its value through her investment. Estelle should get a large amount of money, and everything else my grandma owned should be divided equally between the 2. Fast forward to 2015. My mother had retired and took care 24/7 of her mother, who is suffering from dementia. The alternative of putting my grandma in a nursing home was out of the question for us. As long as it was somehow possible, my mother wanted my grandma to stay in the house that she built with her husband and that she called home. I haven't lived in the house for a long time, but I still visited whenever I could to relieve my mother of work. But these opportunities are few and far between, as I live and work around 2 hours away by car. So I was all the more pleased that my mother got help with housework for a few hours a week. This domestic help, let's call her Nadine, is the girlfriend of Estelle's son Tim. When Tim was a teenager, he had fallen out with his father, and most of our family had very few contacts with him. He showed up once a year, called on our grandma's birthday and on Christmas. For over 20 years he was, besides these 3 occasions, basically non-existent. Nadine works full-time in a nursing home. After having been in the hospital for a few days, my grandma was supposed to be in that very nursing home for a while. The insurance companies offer this option, so that caregiving relatives should be able to recover for a few days themselves, and my mother really needed the break. But my mother was not granted this break. On the second day, in her demented confusion, she crawled under her room neighbor's bed and did not let the nursing staff lure her out from under it. Nadine then called Tim, who came by. While playing hide and seek, my grandma was slightly injured and was taken back to the hospital. After that, she refused to go back to the nursing home, and my mother gave in and took her home. In the next few months, it was 2016 then, Tim appeared once a week to, as he said, take care of grandma. This taking care consisted of going to grandma, who was sitting in her TV chair, holding her hand, asking if everything was okay, and driving off 15 minutes later. At this point I would like to emphasize again that my mother has basically sacrificed herself since 2011 to look after her mother in need of care. She never moved more than 50 meters from my grandma without someone to take her place. Both my grandmother's doctor and the official auditors in charge of the nursing service had certified my mother that my grandmother was doing great under her supervision. Estelle's birthday was in March. My mother told me later that Estelle had advised her in a conversation that she should put some money aside for the time when grandma is no longer there. Nadine celebrated his birthday in July. Since my grandmother was again spending a few days in short-term care at that time so that my mother could recover a little, Tim offered to pick up grandma for the party. And in August the mood changed. Estelle expressed concern that my grandma's confusion was really dementia and instead suggested that grandma was in her condition because of poor care from my mother. Tim was increasingly aggressive towards my mother. In a conversation I insisted on participate, he accused my mother of embezzling my grandmother's money and evading taxes. And although I am a peace-loving person, I lost my composure a little, and I was only a blink away from beating him. After we calmed down again, I suggested that instead of just coming by for 15 minutes a week and spreading accusations, he should really take care of grandma and look after her for a week at a time. He agreed. 2 weeks later, Tim and Tim's brother appeared with his family and picked up grandma for a visit to a fair. When they came back, they told my mother that they had ordered a new TV chair for grandma and that my mother should pay for it with her money. The reason was that my mother lived rent-free in grandma's house and practically doesn't do anything. Since my grandmother was so gracious to take in a mother and her 2 children, she was entitled to the money my mother supposedly saved on rent. A few weeks later my mother had an appointment and asked Estelle to take care of grandma during that time. When she came back there was also a note on the table. Estelle had taken grandma with her to look after her. First a week to try out. The joy that my mother had about the free time she gained quickly vanished when it turned out 2 days later that Estelle took the opportunity to go to her bank with my grandmother to revoke my mother the right to access my grandmother's account. We only found out about it by accident. A few days later Estelle appeared accompanied by Tim, his 2 siblings, and their families and got clothes, jewelry and everything valuable that my grandmother owned. They said that my grandma wanted to stay with Estelle now, because she couldn't stand my mother anymore. The mood between my mother and grandma had deteriorated noticeably in the months since the first stay at the nursing home. At first, we assumed that the dementia was getting worse. A few days later, 9 people came to my mother's home, including my grandmother, Estelle, Tim, T.S., siblings, and their family. When my mother was about to let 2 visitors out of the door, one of the group stormed through the open front door, pushing my mother and sister aside and demanding that they leave the lower apartment immediately. They supposedly had no right to be there and are only allowed to stay in the upper apartment. A neighbor saw the incident and called the police. The group convinced the police that my mother actually lived in the apartment upstairs and had no right to be downstairs. To this day I still don't understand why the policeman accepted it that way. In any case, he asked my mother to leave the lower apartment until the matter was legally clarified. The police then disappeared. The group then took the opportunity to exchange the lock and search the apartment for incriminating material that they could use against my mother. Unsurprisingly, they didn't find anything. My mother hadn't done anything wrong. The day after, my mother went to see a lawyer to give her access to the home again. After a week back and forth, my relatives agreed to let my mother back into the apartment. They cleared the furniture out of the apartment beforehand, because they thought it belonged to my grandmother, and switched back to the old locks. Since they were 9 again and my mother had a nervous breakdown from the whole affair anyway, and was on the verge of the second, I wanted to receive the key in her place. However, they insisted that my mother personally collect the key. Since I could already imagine why my relatives insisted of being in a group of 9, to give the key to a 70-year-old woman personally, I had an idea. I picked up my smartphone in a clearly visible position and activated the recording function. As I expected, most of them noticed my cell phone and remained silent. All except my grandma. Although she could hardly see anything, she recognized me and wanted to talk to me. She accused me and my mother of plotting against her. That she always supported me and she couldn't understand how we could do that to her. It broke my heart to hear what monsters my mother and I had become in her mind. But I knew that this was the dementia talking. I listened patiently and tried to explain what she had misunderstood, but I also knew that she had sunk too far in her illness to convince her of the truth. One of the allegations in that conversation was that my mother and I wanted her out of the house. As already written, that was not the case. But I have to be grateful today that my grandma said that. Estelle was sitting next to her at the time and reflexively replied it wasn't him, the others. At the time, I was too fixated on my grandma that I hadn't even noticed. Fortunately, I had my phone in my hand the whole time. When I listened to the conversation a while later, it finally clicked and I could slap myself today for not noticing it earlier. Since the incident at the nursing home, the mood between my mother and grandma had deteriorated noticeably. We had blamed it on dementia, but now it was clear to us that in her condition between dementia and the strong painkillers she was taking, my relatives had talked her into believing some conspiracy against her. My mother then applied for guardianship for my grandma. In Germany, it is regulated in such a way that it is first checked whether the care is necessary. That was a relatively straightforward matter. Then a judge has to check whether there is a possibility that a relative will take over the guardianship. This test was an on-site appointment at Estelle. As I could deduct from the court papers, the judge was of the opinion relatively quickly that family internal guardianship was not possible. The decisive factor was apparently, among other things, the aggressive behavior of my relatives towards my mother, whereby the judge was almost injured with a burning cigarette. Mrs. G was declared to be my grandmother's guardian. A few weeks after Mrs. G took over her job, she paid my mother a visit. Ms. G said that she was amazed when she met my mother for the first time. After all, she wasn't the hell spawn my relatives described her. We learned that Estelle's family had apparently spread wild rumors about my mother in town. We also learned that apparently my grandmother set up a new will. Since my mother lives in a small town, it didn't take long to find out that Tim was named the sole heir in the new will. Nadine had said the same to a friend, and if you know someone who knows someone. Small town. My grandma died in July 2017. Shortly afterwards, I drove to the court to deposit my grandma's will there so that it could take effect. The lady there said there would already be another recent will. I still insisted on depositing the old one. The will was opened a few weeks later. We saw for the first time what we are dealing with. The new will was drawn up by a notary, which is normally better than a handwritten will from over 20 years ago. In the will, Tim is established as the sole heir with Estelle in the second position, in the event that Tim would have died before my grandmother. Not a word about the fact that part of my mother's house already belonged to her, instead she was only given a right to live in the upper apartment. But the real shock came when we saw the date. The will was written in July 2016. On the day when Tim and Estelle had so generously agreed to pick up Grandma from the nursing home. When they were still trying to pretend everything was fine, and their only concern was Grandma's well-being. I made an appointment with an inheritance lawyer. The lawyer first wanted to convince my mother to only sue for her legal inheritance claim, and to otherwise accept the will. Challenging a notarial will is one of the most difficult cases you can try in German courts, and it takes a lot of evidence to do that. My time to shine. It took me almost an hour to convince the lawyer that my grandma had dementia, and that the new will is therefore invalid. Doctors' reports that certified dementia back in 2011. The report for the guardianship. Every minute I presented her with new documents, and in the end she is ready to go into battle with us. So the matter goes to court, which means that the lawyers write letters back and forth. In one of the letters, Tim's lawyer mentions that there is an assessment from a Dr. A that clearly confirms that my grandma did not have dementia. That would contradict the evidence I submitted to my lawyer. So the court commissioned a new, independent expert assessment. Although I had a lot of evidence and the behavior of my grandmother was always a clear sign of dementia for me, we waited a little nervously for the assessment. We received the assessment, and what can I say? I haven't read anything so beautiful and sad at the same time for a long time. It is sad because the expert quotes from many reports that describe what my grandma was going through after she was brought to Estelle's house. Nice because the appraiser completely dismantled the other side's argument. For every argument that the other side has come up with by then, the appraiser has evidence to invalidate it. Most impressive is the fact that the alleged report by Dr. A is completely worthless to the other side. On the contrary, the doctor was so incompetent that he accidentally not only failed to refute my grandmother's dementia, he even confirmed it. So there is a court date. The appraiser, Dr. A, and the notary who wrote the will are present. A is given the opportunity to defend his report before the judge. And he only makes it worse. It is going too far to explain that now. In any case, A made it clear to the judge that he had no idea how to carry out the test. Then it's the notary's turn. When he testified, it turns out that there were 2 appointments with him and my grandma. And in their attempt to look particularly good in front of the judge, Estelle and Tim admit that they were both present at both appointments. Not only that, apparently the conversation and further coordination between the notary and my grandmother went completely through Estelle's hands. The trial ends and my mother's lawyer is overjoyed. She explains to me that if there were any doubts that the new will does not reflect the will of my grandma, these are finally resolved by the statement of the notary. A few days later, the judge gives the verdict, and it's even better than expected. The house was awarded to my mother. Tim is no longer entitled to even 1 cent from my grandma's inheritance. All claims that Estelle could still make against my mother, i.e. both the stated sum of money from the old will and possible claims under the law, are offset against what was in his possession at the time of my grandma's death. So she has some old furniture, clothes, some jewelry, etc. And what it looks like so far, that means that's all she can hope for. You said any character. Many moons ago I was part of a malicious compliance. So here it goes. Background. The summer before I entered high school, the Ministry of Education decided to change the standardized testing they used for entry to universities. It had happened in the past and usually it took a year to implement changes. But this plan was really complicated and needed 2 years to implement. Laymen like you and me can't comprehend. It's called throw everything at the wall and see what sticks. Guess which class got to be the lab rats? Yeep, mine. We started school with only a vague idea of what the changes will be, until mid-October. Then we learned that the first changes will be implemented on the midterms. The midterms used to be 2 weeks and provided 40% of the final grade. But the new plan was a full month and count for only 20% towards the final grade. Also, a major player for the malicious compliance was our literature teacher, let's call her Karen. Now, I have to admit, she was good at her subject. The problems in her teaching came from prejudice and preconceptions. On a 25-people class, she used to work with 4 or 5 of them, to be specific kids from upper-class families or the best part of town. The rest of us were just background for her. A few of the parents had complained, but due to reasons we learned later, she was always engaging during inspections and kept her job. The malicious compliance. Midterms time. It's the one of the new tests. It's creative writing. Now, as I said, this was one of the new tests. The ministry had said general instructions for the tests, but left the specifics to each school. So for this one, Karen set the specifics. The general instructions for this one asked from the teacher to pick a book from the syllabus and the pupil to write at least 800 words from the POV of one of the characters. Karen had a hard-on for epics, so she chose the Iliad, expecting everyone to pick a hero. Everybody did, except 3 of us. JK, Indy and myself. I don't know if we wanted to rebel against the system or against Karen, but the 3 of us didn't follow the norm. Now, JK was a really good student, but had the usual trouble in Karen's class. She chose Andromache, the wife of Hector. She described the last day of Hector from Andromache's point of view. My friend Indy is a mythology buff, he became an archaeologist, that's why Indy, and absolutely hated Karen's teachings of the material. He picked Zeus. He basically wrote Zeus's POV, noticing every female named in the Iliad and his horniness. Me, I choose Cassandra. She had the gift of prophecy, but the curse of never being believed. I went the whole POV being we're all doomed and never believed. The results come out and we are the only failed, 8,7 and 7 out of 20, because we, according to Karen, completely missed the point of the test. But the aftermath. Unbeknownst to everybody, except the principal, the ministry had sent instructors to grade the tests independently of the teachers. They published their grades and 3 particular tests have huge grade discrepancies. So, one misty morning, the 3 of us are called to the meeting room. Inside is our principal, a clearly fuming Karen and 3 people we don't know. They introduced themselves as part of the Ministry of Education. They want us to explain why did choose those characters. We all said it said any character, so we chose one we liked. Every time we said that, they glanced at Karen. They thanked us, told us that their grade will go towards our final grade. Karen had inspectors dropping on her unexpectedly. As I said in the beginning, she had passed the local ones because of something she did. She was having an affair with the assistant director of the local education department, and he always notified her before the inspection. Now they came directly from the ministry, and she was always unprepared. She was allowed to finish the year, and then was dismissed. The ministry took a year and a half to figure out the system. We were the first class to officially take the new standardized test. Creative writing was part of the literature exam. JK became a journalist and a writer. Indy became an archaeologist. As for me, I'm in here. The referee's compliance. Okay, one more paintball MC that I watched a referee take part in. Quick info in paintball: if you call for a paint check on yourself, you can't keep playing, in case you had been hit, until the referee calls you clean, and if the referee calls a paint check on you, nobody can shoot at you or move up on you. Back in my tournament days, there was this one team that had a bit of a reputation for, if not breaking the rules, then bending them beyond recognition. Their captain, who we will call Stompin' Tom, was a little intense. He also had a tendency to use the paint check rule to stall a game. Nobody moves up, while his team could regroup. So, our team of 5 was up against their team of 5, and to be honest, their team was the favorite. They were serious, while we played for fun. The game starts off fine, and we get a lucky break, and we take out one of their guys early. This rattles Stompin' Tom, as he expected a cakewalk. I was the one shooting at him, and I know I am not even close when he calls a paint check. Just as the referee starts to go over and check him, I hear our captain yell our team name. Yeehaw! Now, for this tournament we had practiced a crazy new tactic. If anyone on our team at any time yells our team name, we all just get up and run directly at the enemy. I told you we played for fun. So we do. I get up and run right past Stompin' Tom. I don't have to worry about him, as he called for the check and can't shoot me, so I shoot the guy behind him, who has no idea why 5 guys were running towards him screaming. I hear Stompin' Tom sputtering behind me, yelling how this isn't fair, as my teammate grabbed the flag. We had now shot all of his team, and he wanted to have them all back, and us moved back to before he called for the check. The referee laughed and reminded Stompin' Tom that he had called the check, not the referee. But that since he was clean, he could play on now. Stompin' Tom looked at all 5 of us all around him and, well, stomped off. We got the points for him as well. If you made it to the end of the video, thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe and share, and we will see you in the next video.